Well, thank you. It's great to see so many people here today. I was commenting to Sue that I think I won the prize for having the photograph that looks least like what I currently look like. Also, I was inspired by the title of her talk, The Power of Dreams, and I find mine is a little on the bland side, US V2X status update. So maybe informally I'll rebrand mine as the harsh light of reality. So I'm going to talk about where we are with standards and where we are with spectrum. Some of this on the spectrum side, Jeff already covered. And then I'll just end with some comments about what I see, my own personal opinions about the prospects for achieving the goal of widespread V2X deployment, which is certainly the goal that we're striving for, and I think probably all of us are striving for. So the first note on standards is actually not US specific, but it's something that's a little nearer to my heart. I've been working on this, so I wanted to give you an update. As some of you know, in IEEE, we're working on an amendment. You can think it's called the Next Generation V2X, NGV, also formally called 802.11bd, according to 802.11 terminology. But you can think of it as kind of DSRC plus. It's a next generation of DSRC. It takes advantage of the state-of-the-art PHY concepts that have been developed in other 802.11 amendments like AC and AX and BE, so that it has even better reliability and higher data rates. But the key is that it's structured in such a way that it's a superset of the 802.11p DSRC amendment, so it's fully backward compatible and coexistent and interoperable. And that means that if you, let's say you deploy 11BD in your devices in Europe, you're going to be able to talk to every one of those million 11P equipped devices that are already on the road there. You'll be able to transmit to them, you'll be able to receive their transmissions. And over time, when the population becomes dominated by BD, you can also talk to your BD neighbors using this more advanced language with the higher performance. So that's the seamless evolution path that IEEE has set out to achieve, and we can keep going with this in future generations as well. So it's an important achievement, and this will be published by the end of this year. More at the higher layer, in the US, the SAE V2X committee families have been quite active in publishing a variety of standards. Of note are J3161/1 and J3161, which are focused on operation over LTV2X in channel 183, the 20 megahertz channel, for BSMs and other applications. Those were published after some delay related to patent disclosures and assurances, but those are now out in public. And other groups have been publishing quite a variety of other, I'll call them application-oriented standards, and there are several others that are in the works. So you can see a list there. This is not exhaustive. So the summary message on the standardization and technology side is that the standards are there. The standards are in place, and this is not holding back deployment. Let's go to spectrum. Now, most of you have seen this or similar slides. Jeff put something up similarly. Let's just briefly recap where we are with the FCC. We've had the first report and order that created the Uni 4 band, took away the 45 megahertz, and indicated the intention in a second report and order to switch from DSRC and transition to cellular V2X. It also created what they called a streamlined waiver process for those who wanted to deploy cellular V2X early, so that is in place, and some have taken advantage of that. This first report and order went into effect last July, and by this July, all of the DSRC deployed in the lower 45 megahertz had to vacate, had to either move or turn off. With regard to the second report and order, they published this further notice of proposed rulemaking that made several proposals and asked several questions. Some of the key points are, how are we actually going to define what this C-V2X means, because it can mean something specific or it can mean something more general and more of an umbrella type of term. Their proposal was, let's define it as specific. Let's define it as release 14 LTE V2X. And then they also proposed a 2-year transition timeline from the point of the second report and order to move away from DSRC, which is still, by the way, the technology that's defined in the rules for the upper 30 megahertz. Also, importantly, it proposed to allow outdoor use by Wi-Fi and other unlicensed users of the Uni 4 band. And this is something of a double-edged sword for us because it brings a higher interference risk, but it also, for those of us who are concerned about having too little spectrum for V2X, it also opens the possibility of us doing V2X in the Uni 4 band. We can't do that under the first report and order where the Uni band is limited to indoor. And of course, we're waiting. We don't know when this second report and order will come. So what were the responses to the first report and order and the FNPRM? Well, we saw some petitions directly to the FCC to reconsider their decision. And this is usually what's done when someone thinks the FCC made kind of an objective error that can be corrected. We ask you to reconsider, and if they agree, they can change it, but usually they don't. And we aren't very optimistic that these petitions will result in anything. They've been there now for more than a year, and we haven't seen any action taken on them. We also had the lawsuits from ITS America and AASHTO, which was recently culminated with a decision favoring the FCC. So that approach seems to be at its end. That brings us to the waiver requests, and we had one we'll call it the joint waiver request that came out almost a year ago in December of 2021, and then didn't result in any immediate action, but after about 6 months, the FCC put it out for public comment, so now we've had people have a chance to comment on it. From the automotive industry, the comments were almost unanimously positive for issuing the waiver. And there are several parties to this, including automakers and state DOTs and suppliers. And we've also had several states file separate waiver requests. And we also don't know when the FCC will act on these things. So there is some uncertainty, but there is also some reason to believe that this is not an indefinite process, and at least the waivers probably should receive some action, I'll say soon. What that means is hard to say. End of the year maybe? I don't know. So just as I said, the summary on technology is that technology is not the barrier to deployment. The regulations may be currently, in the short term, a barrier to deployment, but we don't expect that to be the long-term case. Eventually, and probably not too long from now, the regulations will be sufficiently mature that they'll no longer be a reasonable barrier to deployment. So let me take one little bit of a deep dive into one aspect of the regulation, which is this question of what does CV2X mean? As I mentioned, the proposal from the FCC is, let's say that it means just release 14 LTV2X. We've seen some commenters that have asked for a little more flexibility. 5GAA issued comments where they struck out the specific reference to release 14. Recently, Autotalks suggested that channel 180, the 10 megahertz channel, be set aside for 5G new radio. And in Toyota's own comments, we suggested that it's premature to lock in a specific protocol and that we should give the industry a time to reestablish a consensus, I'll say. We once had a consensus, we no longer have a consensus, and we hope that we will once again have a consensus. And it's best if the FCC is not in the position of picking the winner, but rather reflecting the consensus that the industry arrives at. So lastly then, where does this leave us? In kind of a summary, technology is not the barrier. We have the technology, if anything, we have too many technologies because we have, for example, not only the LTE version that was standardized first more than 5 years ago, but now we have the 5G version that was standardized first more than 2 years ago. And it's not uncommon in the hallways here to hear OEMs talking to each other and saying things like, well, you know, if we're going to deploy in 2 or 3 years and we haven't really started yet, why is it that we're doing the older technology and not, you know, starting with the thing that's actually freshest? But you know, that's what I mean when I say we need to have a technology consensus, and we don't currently. As far as the regulations, they will soon be in place such that they shouldn't be a major barrier, although I do note that there is a continuing concern about interference that's allowed under the regulations from the Wi-Fi side, or even within the band between the two ITS channels. That could be considered a barrier by some stakeholders, but for the most part, the regulations won't be really holding people back. So if it's not the technology, if it's not the regulations, what is it that we need to solve to bridge to the point where we can get to that goal of widespread deployment? This is really the hard question, and it's one that my message to you is this is what we should be talking about. I've heard a lot of discussion here about the waivers and how we need them, and then we just need to get to deployment. Well, but how do we do that? That's not an obvious. To me, it's not an obvious answer, and it's not obvious that we can just get there. We have, frankly, some stakeholders who were willing to provide leadership in the previous regime where we had consensus, and maybe they're not in the same position to try to provide that same leadership under the new regime, and maybe those who are advocating primarily for changing regimes are going to have an extra responsibility for creating that leadership, showing that path. USDOT may have a role. I'm looking at you, Jeff. We need that partnership, I think, and we need that kind of neutral party to maybe in some cases give us some incentives, or at least bring us together. So I'll leave it at that. I want to be as optimistic as possible. I couldn't be more passionate about getting to that widespread deployment and reaping the benefits of V2X. This is my professional goal, and I think we have a lot of work. But I think we have a lot of work in front of us. It's not going to happen automatically. So let's roll up our sleeves and find that path. Thank you very much.
Yeah, I think we clearly need more than 30 megahertz of spectrum. I think there have been several analyses that have shown that from individual companies and from industry groups, and we agree with those analyses. But having said that, 30 megahertz is enough to do something, and so we should use it. So one thing to realize is that if we're using LTE V2X, we need a 20 megahertz channel to do what another technology needs only 10 megahertz for, because we send every message twice. So we really have one channel available in the 30 megahertz, and we can use that for some core safety applications, like we can send the basic safety message and have imminent crash avoidance. We can send a lot of infrastructure to vehicle information and enable several applications, and we should do that. We should use that spectrum. But we also need more spectrum because we've realized that connectivity has an important role to play with automated driving, and also to protect vulnerable road users, and it's very likely that the existing spectrum won't be enough for those applications, so we need more. So yeah, it's important to understand that there are some new generations of lower layer protocols that are becoming available. One of them is from 3GPP, and it's the 5G version of V2X that was standardized in 2020, and chips are now becoming available. Another comes from the IEEE family, and it's an advanced version of DSRC. It's called 802.11bd, and that's going to be published at the end of this year. The important thing about 11bd is that it's completely backward compatible with DSRC. So if you're in a region where DSRC is being deployed and you deploy this next generation version, it can talk. You can communicate with all of the legacy devices, and that forms a nice seamless evolution path for future generations. On the other hand, the protocols coming out of the cellular world don't typically have that backward compatibility. So the 4G LTE V2X, 5G new radio V2X are not intended to coexist, let alone interoperate with each other. So as we are looking at deployment and how we can move forward, one of the things that's lacking right now is a consensus in our industry about which one of these technologies to use. There was a time when we all had consensus about the technology, and that time, unfortunately, is gone. So we have to evaluate, is it going to be LTE V2X? Is it going to be one of these next generation protocols? Our view is that as long as it works, anything that the industry can get behind from a consensus point of view and achieve widespread deployment is what we should put our efforts into. We're not pushing any particular technology. So with regard to regulations, there's really two types that we pay attention to in the United States. There's the spectrum regulations, which are coming out of the FCC, and then there's the vehicle regulations that could potentially come out of the US Department of Transportation. We've been engaged a lot on the FCC side, and we have a pretty clear path from them about what's going to happen. We don't know exactly how quickly it will happen, but we expect in some reasonable time that they will make decisions about waivers and that they'll issue the final rules for the new 5.9 gigahertz band. So there will be certainty about what the spectrum regulations are pretty soon, I would say within the next year, some of that even sooner. And that's quite important. We all need to understand what those rules are. I would say it's necessary but not sufficient for us to achieve our larger goals. On the US DOT side, of course, we had an effort from NHTSA in 2015, 2016 to develop a regulation that would require V2X in every new vehicle. And that's been put on the back burner. And there are some people who think that we really need to revive that if we're ever going to get to the widespread deployment that is the point where we can achieve the maximum benefits. Other people think maybe we can get there with a voluntary deployment model, even without that mandate. But what that remains to be seen. We have some skepticism about whether the voluntary model will be good enough. And so if there's a way to move, if there's a way for US DOT to move and provide incentives or mandates, that's probably a faster path to the nation receiving the benefits of V2X that we're all seeking. Yeah, so with regard to the technology, I guess there's two things to say. One, of course we want to take advantage of modern wireless communication techniques that are continuing to evolve. So if that's coming from the 3GPP community, the latest is from the 5G standards, and it won't be too long before people will be talking about 6G, but the 5G part is the most recent, and we're starting to see chips announced. On the IEEE side, it's this 802.11 next generation V2X or 11BD amendment that I mentioned earlier. So it has to be capable and it has to be state of the art. But then the second part that's really key is that we have an evolutionary path. Because cars are on the road for much longer typically than these standards have a life. So we need to make sure that, and the IEEE model is really the paradigm that we'd like to follow. As I mentioned in my previous question, the next generation V2X 11BD is fully backward compatible and interoperable with the legacy 802.11p. So those who want to deploy 11p can do so knowing that their investment is going to be protected. Even as the technology moves forward, their devices are going to fully be able to participate in the communication. Those who want to invest in 11BD can do so knowing that they'll be able to communicate with all of the devices on the road, even those of the previous generation and of the future generation. So as long as we can build evolution into the technology, into the generations, that's a great thing for the automotive sector. Unfortunately, we don't have that with some of the protocols coming out of the cellular side. So it would be great if we could convince the cellular community we need to build that into the future generations. So 6G may be backward compatible with 5G when that comes around. Yeah, so I guess what we're looking for is we're looking at the landscape of technology, of regulation, and also of industry cooperation. At the end of the day, V2X is a cooperative technology, so we need to have cooperation, we need to have common understanding with other stakeholders. We believe that the technologies are not the limiting factor. We believe that the spectrum regulations, even though they haven't been favorable to what we want to do in the long term, are at least going to be stabilized, and we'll know what the rules are. So we're looking at that third element, which is the industry level cooperation, as the biggest challenge right now. As I mentioned before, there was a time when there was a broad consensus in our U.S. industry about how to move forward, and there was strong support for the NHTSA mandate idea. We no longer have that common consensus, and we need to establish a new one, frankly. And if we can, then we can expect major automakers to be confident in making deployment choices. And that means that we would be confident that our customers are going to realize the strong benefits of widespread V2X deployment that we all hope for. If we can't be confident of that, if we think that our customers will not have any other cars to talk to, it's very difficult for us to ask them to put that in their car. So that's what we're seeking. We're seeking widespread deployment, and we think that the biggest challenge and near-term focus, frankly, should be on reestablishing an industry consensus on how to move forward for that. I guess my final thought is just that I've heard a lot of discussion here at the ITS World Congress about important near-term issues like waivers for the spectrum rules and getting the spectrum rules solidified. Those are important. What I'd like to hear more people beginning to focus on is, and then what? And then how do we move forward? Once all of those things are in place, how do we, as I was just talking about, how do we rebuild a national consensus on a way that we can move forward all of the deployment stakeholders, from the automaker side, from the infrastructure side, from the government and regulation side. We all need to be on the same page, and we need some leadership. Maybe some of that is coming from automakers, maybe some of that is coming from US DOT. We need some leadership to help pull everyone together and say, let's agree on a common path forward. If we can get there, then some of our more optimistic goals, I think, can be realized.
All right, before I start to talk about our Honda's perspective, I do want to give a round of applause to the European and the Volkswagen's leadership to actually deploy something in large scale. And I think John Kenny, we've known each other for almost 20 years. He deserves another round of applause for continue pushing the technology forward. Before we talk about dreams, I think one way to have a good dream is to lower your expectation. That's my temperature sensing for the US situation. So I work for Honda Research Institute, US, and our mission is to solve complex problems with applications that Honda currently are investigating. And we're developing partnerships with other stakeholders to move forward together, such as even competitors. We've been working side by side for a number of years. So where V2X is in our safety roadmap, and when we were discussing the slides, there are internal discussions as so should we move that V2X part towards a bit right direction because of the uncertainty. I said, let's keep it there because we are redefining what V2X is today. As John is speaking, there are next generation coming up. There are new approaches US DOT are investigating. So I'll keep that as is. This is our dream map. I see Nick and other Ohio DOT people here. They are working very closely with Honda in Ohio to build this probably the world's longest continuous V2X covered corridor, about 35 miles northwest of Columbus, Ohio. And there will be a large number of roadside infrastructures along the commuting route that many of the Honda associates go back and forth to and from work. And in the middle of that route, there's a city called Marysville, where we built a smart intersection that very similar to some of the European colleagues' concept of using infrastructure sensing technology to relay that safety information from unequipped vehicles that can be detected by the infrastructure and then sense those information to the equipped vehicles. What this build is a fully connected environment, not counting on everyone being connected. And that infrastructure give a bird's eye view, and then that incentivize early deployment. As long as you have the technology, you enjoy this fully connected environment, while other unequipped vehicles may take decades to get the technology benefit. And so these are the pictures of the just regular traffic cameras, and in the Marysville intersections, on the right side are our vision processing capability to detect and translate those vehicles and pedestrians' information, digitize them at pixel by pixel level. So the safety message sent from the infrastructure of each of these cars and pedestrians are almost as accurate as if they have a device in their hands or in their car. And if you come to Ohio, we are more than happy to give you a tour. It is a fascinating experience. We launched this in 2018. Back then, again, coming back to the dream, 2018 is a great year, or 2 years after the notice of proposed rulemaking from NHTSA. We were hoping towards a larger scale deployment. And Honda has always been wanting the infrastructure to be part of this progress so that our customer can enjoy day one benefit. That's 4 years ago. And while 4 years has passed, we have collected more than 1 million miles of road travel. And you've seen those numbers. Someone said, well, what does it mean? To us, it's a great opportunity to understand how the cars interact with each other, even at the low density level. We have statistics that shows even at 2 to 3% of a penetration level, we can see the interactions last as typically 5 to 20 seconds. And that's long enough to have two cars engage in a meaningful conversation, to share safety information, awareness information, to make the driving environment much more comfortable. It's almost like a driving your neighborhood type of feeling. And then this 5G mobile edge computing is a very different approach. We started working with Verizon 3 years ago. And again, that timing comes also as we see V2X is facing challenges. This is not a direct communication, and it's not all the way to the top of the cloud and coming back. It's kind of, I consider that if I describe this to my kids, it's like the typical telematics V to N to V is go from the first floor, go all the way to the 7th floor of the cloud, and then come back to the first floor of another building. This is going to the 3rd floor, and that's how the latency can be reduced. We've worked with a carrier to prove that latency can be under 100 milliseconds, and I can do the V2V from our office in Detroit to the car in Marysville. That covers hundreds of miles of range, and you don't need an RSU in every corner. And our vehicles, most of the cars by the large deployment time probably already have 5G radios in their car. So there's no dedicated hardware needed. And that, to me, solve a lot of challenges. Well, I also hear European colleagues talking about aftermarket solution. One of the motivations for Honda to join the Tampa CV pilot a few years ago is to explore dealer operated installation solutions and how our real Honda customers see this technology and their benefit. So we worked with dealer. It's still a preliminary retrofit solution that's similar to many of the pilot program. But what we learned from the dealer and the customer direct experiences, people want this. Once they understand the benefit, they really, some of the customers we talked to saying, why is it not in the car today? I want it now. And that's a very genuine testimony to motivate us to say, why are we waiting? We've been researching for almost 20 years. And that's why John said his picture doesn't really look like what John looked. I think we all have the same type of pictures. 20 years ago when we started, we looked very different. I attended the summit, and this is my own personal view of a summary. There's still need, I think the roadmap is still not very clear, and the number of OEMs got together and we were discussing really the motivation and the regulation, or at least NCAP, is missing. Unlike the European side, it was moving full speed forward. And infrastructure deployment, again, where's the car? Where's the infrastructure? It's still the chicken and egg problem still remains in the US side. And of course, the spectrum, and we talk about interference. And also, I think I want to remind people, aside from the spectrum, there's also intellectual property related topics that are often not being discussed. That is one of the factors that may slow down a different technology approach, because I was co-chairing the SAE committee on developing the SAE standard for NHTSA to reference notice of rulemaking back in 2016. And one of the check boxes from NHTSA is to check the intellectual property. And I remember there was one patent related to the security system, the security management. And that company issued a letter with a friendly licensing term to SAE. And at that time, SAE's IP policy is that that term needs to be applied to all users. And that was the final box that checked before NHTSA issued the notice for proposed rulemaking. Fast forward, now we're looking for US DOT for potential regulation or NCAP. I think that box become much bigger because a different technology have, from our understanding, have more than 100 standard essential patents on it. And those are owned by many foreign companies. I think it's going to take a government a long time to check that box. So that's my sense of the regulation. How soon that may come, it's a big question mark. So the challenge, I think challenge remain. We all know this corporate safety, it is going to be significant in enhancing safety. And we are looking for different solutions because we think the direct communication is facing uncertainty. The spectrum, the interference is one thing, and I agree with John, it's actually not technology. They're IP, they're government regulation. Those are things people don't often consider at the engineering level that eventually can put a very significant dent on the deployment direction. So we are looking for other solutions and continue to research towards our collision and fatality-free goal by 2050. Of course, we welcome like-minded partner to join us who share the same vision. And I do want to come back to the 5G page and reiterate why we are looking for a different solution. The challenges I see as a vehicle side, there needs to be, for the direct communication in a traditional definition, you need a dedicated hardware. On the infrastructure, you need a lot of RSUs to maintain. And on the regulation side, there's a spectrum, there's a government, whether it's mandate or NCAP. This solution kind of solves all these problems. There's no needs for dedicated vehicle hardware. That one mobile edge computing unit covers hundreds of miles of range. And the government really don't have that much of a regulation needs for this because I would consider that's organic technology. And I often reminds me, as the engineering side are dreaming and thinking, we have a solution, let's look at the problem to solve. The world moved on. The technology evolved so fast. The newer technology have so much stronger and much capable performance that we never dreamed 20 years ago. So for us, this is the time to reflect, rethink, should we continue with what we already had a number of years ago, or should we move forward to look to a very different approach? Even the European side, I think they're doing great because they set the right foundation years ago. Unfortunately, the U.S. side is lagging. And maybe this is one chance for U.S. side to take a different approach to be on a similar level field with our European colleagues. Thank you.
We all know that the industry used to have a 70 megahertz of a spectrum dedicated for V2X safety. Recently, the Federal Communication Commission has changed the rule, and that certainly have impact on what we can do with the limited band. And we understand the final ruling with detail is still not clear yet, and that made the process such as certification becoming a bit of a challenge. The future of V2X, a lot built on the past. We've worked as an industry collaborative effort since almost 20 years ago to build this fascinating technology to save people's lives. I think aside from the spectrum challenges or other factors that impact the U.S. deployment, focusing maybe more on the application side and look at other technology that may be able to achieve similar performance level, such as 5G, mobile edge computing, and a solution like that. I think it may be time to rethink what didn't work in the past and what might work in the future. Yeah, I think from Tampa experience, we know there is the vehicle infrastructure benefit has been very prominent. The runway driving and also VRU protection, such as vehicle pedestrian related warning. And I think those really highlights the benefit of a V2X that both has the infrastructure day one benefit and also protect other road users in addition to the typical V2V applications. I think one of the reasons the industry are hoping for a regulation is to boost the deployment and increase the penetration level so that the V2V benefit can be realized earlier. If we have a lot of vehicles coming on board around the same time, we're only counting on a certain OEM deploying and other OEMs watch and see, that penetration growth will take a much longer, decades, to realize a higher percentage of cars equipped. Well, that's the typical engineering answer would be it depends on how that's used. I think from the industry consortium research that's done almost 10 years ago, we've seen up to 200 vehicle level, we can reach a reasonable performance for only vehicle communication. But if you count handheld devices for vulnerable road user protection, such as smartphones and pedestrians, those can become challenging if all these communications are shared while vehicles are transmitting. So the 30 megahertz, I do see some challenges on that. Well, I am very encouraged that a US-born technology being deployed, at least in Europe, was moving forward. I think the European pattern really shows what's working, which is a trust relationship between the automakers and regulators and infrastructure providers. So all three pillars needs to have the same vision with the same timing and with the commitment to move forward. I think US can learn a lot from the European experience.